Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. Just going to give folks a moment to load into the room. And while we do that, I will note that we do have an upcoming webinar on November 7th at 1 p.m. Central on portfolio management. If that strikes an interest, or if you know anyone on your team that should be on that webinar, please see the CII events page. Meanwhile, I'll go ahead and welcome you all. We'll go ahead and kick off the webinar. Wanted to thank you all for making time for these important webinars. I know you're all very busy, and we do appreciate your attendance, as well as our members who present these webinars and invite their guest experts. As usual, we will have the Q&A at the very end of the session. So please utilize that gray control panel to enter your questions. We'll hold those at the end. And today I am very happy to introduce the recipient of the 2024 AWP Global Leadership Award, Fernando Espana, with Constructex.
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Shameless promotion here for a very well-deserved award recipient here. So Fernando will go ahead and kick off our webinar, introduce you to our presenters, and we'll connect again over at the Q&A session at the end.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny. Yes, so if you're here, hopefully you're at the right webinar, Collaborative Scope Development and Fundamental Scope Blocks. I believe this is a very critical topic, as that helps us better envision an entirety of a project and the impacts that we can make early on by leveraging these types of tools. So yes, we're going to talk about scope, risk, expectations, and John Strickland's here to drive that along with Jeff. We'll introduce them. About the joint working group, we've been actively involved in helping shape this whole NextGen concept of AWP plus lean plus project production management on how we can leverage all those tools. So you can see we have a lot of folks involved. I'm probably missing a few logos here anyway, but yeah, John and myself have been the co-chairs for several years. So the idea here is to bring all these different opportunities together, right? Lean construction, advanced work packaging, project production management, and a very recent focus on collaborative contracting on how we can bring that as part of this NextGen thinking. So yes, how we do all that and how we blend it is different would be different for every project, every organization, but it's highly available, and we should be thinking about how we leverage all this. So go ahead to the next slide. We have a lot of slides to cover today. So, all right. So if you don't
tell me when to.
I'm going to go ahead and I'll introduce myself. If I am the president of Constructex. I'm also I'm the joint chair of the NextGen joint working group under CII. So I've been heavily involved with not only advanced work packaging, lean construction, PPM, and also these other 3D technology tools to leverage production management for the most part. So John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, John Strickland here, and I'm a construction manager, construction integrator by trade. Been working construction for my whole career, and largely on projects that have a really critical schedule. That's where I kind of made my my name and my way to go. And one of those was a project that Jeff Joyner is talking about here in a little bit. So Jeff, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jeff Joyner. I'm a project manager. I've been a project manager for about 20 years now. I was introduced to lean construction practices in 2015-16 when we started a major project for our company, and I would say that's what made it successful. So
that's great. It's a pretty cool story we're going to hear about a little bit more. So as we go forward, I'm just double checking here. You guys are seeing the screens of slides. I hit the slide in advance. Okay.
Yeah, and it's just a quick point on that. Yeah, a quick point on that for Jeff. Yeah, we have a real, Jeff has got true experience in all this. So it's not like we're introducing something new. We're introducing something that's already proven itself, and we should be leveraging more. So quick point.
Yeah. It's also going to give the perspective of someone who saw it for the first time as we were going into the fire of the furnace, so to speak. The project was pretty hot, and we chose this approach and how it came out. So we're going to talk primarily about two important and interrelated but separate concepts, and that one of them is collaborative scope development, target value delivery. And that's how we're making sure everybody understands what the scope of the project really is, with really good scope understanding and comprehension. The other thing we're going to talk about is a work integration structure. And so we all know about work breakdown structures, but one of the key points we're going to try and make is that you need a corresponding integration structure. And we use something called fundamental scope blocks that are developed during collaborative design and scoping. We're going to talk a bit about how that connects to advanced work packaging, and we'll talk a bit about commercial arrangements, because the first thing I often hear when we bring up lean concepts is, my company will never sign an IFOA. So let's talk about that first, actually. So no doubt about it, collaborative contracting has a lot of major inherent advantages. I won't say that it doesn't, but keep listening, because if your firm or your organization cannot go into a full multi-party contract, I don't think you need to. I think you can get a lot of great benefit, because it's the team integration that's key, and the leadership. And I also will say that the fundamental scope block concept tends to work very well, whatever type of a project you are working on. And so I don't know, Jeff, does that make kind of experience that we didn't actually have a multi-party agreement on the project that we did with you?
Just that collaborative structure was very helpful in making the project move smoothly. So
yeah. So we closely mimicked an IFOA, but we used traditional contracts. And if you have questions, you get a hold of us a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit more about collaborative scope development and target value delivery. Fernando, why don't you kind of summarize a couple of things we can look forward to hearing about?
Yeah. So, obviously, when we start a project, we always want to break it down. And the challenge is, of course, how do we all put all this together, and what are the real points? And sometimes we don't spend enough time. So scope definition distilled into clear and concise data helps us do that. We can visualize much better. We can understand the issues and the integrations. Workplace planning expertise, how do they get engaged, and how do we help support, how things really will come together in the future, not just what we think from a project controls perspective. So how do we enhance that ability to really understand the work itself in the future? Jurisdictional coordination issues, we can resolve that, because depending on where you are in the region, that's always an issue. Path of construction, this technique will help support not only how we look at packaging, how we break the packaging, but how they all come together in a more robust way that links to all other types of things, priorities and what have you. So scope packaging aligned with project production system design are all connected through these fundamental scope blocks. And this was done all, of course, before detailed design. So wow, how do we do that? How do we know what we're really going to go do if we don't have detailed design? Well, This starts the process.
Great. So, I think these are some kind of universal questions. I think almost all clients ask questions like, hey, can we build what we need with the money we've got? When will it be done? And when can you give me answers to those questions? And Jeff, do those sound like some of the questions that you had as we were starting your project?
yeah, those are the standard questions whenever I start a project.
Yeah.
Those are the questions I need to answer.
Yeah, and this win is a huge advantage of the process I'm going to talk to you about, because we can give you that answer much sooner and more accurately. I can take it to some deeper questions, and that is, do we really understand the scope? And do all the participants have a common understanding of the scope and how their part fits with everybody else's? And then how should we develop, package, and communicate it? We're going to talk about communicating scope. And then why is it so darn hard? Well, if your projects are difficult, don't feel bad. This was from a CII report, which I believe referenced McKinsey several years ago. Basically, they said 2/3 of big industrial mega projects fail. And that is if the standard for failure was 20%. So if you came within 20%, you were successful. And that doesn't sound all that great to me when that equates to hundreds of millions of dollars of variance. And they looked at, well, why is that? And sure that the project factors and labor and such were important, but the big things that stood out were how we organize ourselves and how we work together. So that's where the real low-hanging fruit that McKinsey and others have found. And so let's talk about why that might be. And this is a flow I think I've shown an awful lot of times, but on some typical job, not to say it's your job or any other job, but just in general, you go hire an engineer and a CM, you do some kind of a preliminary design, and you come up with some kind of a preliminary estimate. And you say, okay, first thing, okay, does that fit our budget? And if that's no, you might go back and get deep into the preliminary design and scope. But most likely, you've got the team mobilized, the schedule's coming, you'll go right on into detailed design and get bids. And at some point there, you say, hey, does that fit our budget? And if that answer is yes, well, then you'll have a semi-reliable cost. And that's where the change control process normally begins. And also, I guess, the dispute resolution process normally begins there. But kind of the insidious thing is about that is by the time you get to here, you've already spent your whole design budget. You've already spent the whole design duration. These guys are supposed to be off designing some other project. You've already exercised the contractors pretty heavily. So if you go forward and you say, wow, but what happens if we don't get to here? And that is what I would call the now what moment, or the big waste. And so that we have all that effort we put, much of this effort we devoted is now not going to be used. So this is, and we've done a couple things where we talk about the big waste, and this is what we're talking about as the inherent waste there. And there's another reason this comes up. An owner will typically have requirements, and what we find very often is that the owner isn't fully aligned or doesn't fully have all of their requirements designed. So when they hire a design firm to go do a design concept, it won't quite line up. The design concept doesn't quite line up. When the bid documents come out, they don't quite line up with the design concept. Like I said, I was construction background, and the first thing I learned to say is, I can't bid what you intended to design. I can bid what you put on the documents, interpreted in a very restrictive way. And then that's the CMGC understanding does not ever quite understand the bid documents. The trade contractors who bid it don't quite understand it to an even great degree. And by the time the crew gets here, he doesn't understand what his estimator took off. And so these are what we call integration errors. And we're talking, remember that first slide where the big problem was how we're working together and how we're communicating. Well, I think this is a way of explaining that these add a lot of risk. And they may represent the root cause of the problems we're having. And the whole concept of collaborative design and scoping is, to the degree possible, get these people in conversation with each other to define the scope, then capture the scope and go design it that way. So that would be the way we would go through that. And again, Jeff, do you remember seeing slides like that as you were going through the decision for how you were going to go execute your project?
When we first saw that slide, it was kind of a light bulb moment. We definitely went through that process pretty much on every project we went through. So
yeah. Fernando, how about you?
Yeah.
You've seen this slide a couple of times, but
Yeah.
how common do you think that oh my goodness slide is?
Yeah, it is. And what you said before about, the cost of things being out of whack with the expectation and having to go back to do rework. I think even if you accept that, okay, we're sort of in the budget, there is this fear behind the risk of it. I'm still not 100% sure that I've handled that I've covered all the risk. And so that makes a lot of people nervous, even at that end. And this is the way we start addressing it.
Huge point. We weren't planning to talk about this, but it has a huge effect on how much buffer and contingency you need. Yeah. One of the things that this does is sharply reduces the need for buffer and contingency. That's maybe a whole separate presentation. So kind of moving forward, there's some big risk in this. And Fernando, you want to talk about just a few of these?
Right. Yeah. Just time lost. That if you have to go back and redo it, or whether you're on the contracting side, the EPC side, or the owner side. Hey. So biggest fear when I was in the contracting business. Oh, we got the job, and then we say, oh my God, we got the job. We better go back and look at what we did. Because things aren't all that clear. Detailed design deliverables. Hey. How much WIP do you want, and all that rework is a lot of engineering time that people can't work on other more valuable projects or other aspects of the program. right? Hey, capacity, it's getting worse right now, right? So we have to use our resources wisely. You know, one time and done is always our goal. We know that that's not going to be 100%, but hey, we have to be very, very cognizant of that scarcity that we're going to have. And if we have to bring in new engineers all the time to fill in those gaps, well, we know what that does too. So it's an opportunity to train, but it's also an opportunity to overlook something. So anyway, hey, viable projects. How many times do we have to scrap something because it didn't meet budget when it probably could if we rethought it? So anyway, yeah, bad project. Avoid those.
This concept here of a couple things I'll comment on here is, you know, a tremendous amount of the documentation prepared for bid package, I don't think is ever read before the bids are issued. I think that people go through and they try to extract out the nuggets of scope out of the data sheets and other places. And most of you, if you went to a hotel or an airport lately, you signed on to the internet, and I bet you didn't read the terms and conditions.
Yeah.
You know, I think bid packages are a lot like that. I think, Jeff, this viable projects, I think the job we were working on we went through this, and in the earliest days of the project, we were able to streamline the scope to make it viable. And we were speculating that we might never have got that project off the ground if we hadn't gone through that process.
That's a very real point for us. The uncertainty of cost and time was critical to our decision, and without this process, we wouldn't have been able to move forward.
Yeah, that's a lot of done. And of course, we also have learned that when we look back at really bad projects, most really bad projects were losers from day one. And the fundamental concept of the project isn't viable. And so that's what the validation process helps us with, is help us recognize early before we spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars designing it. I'll give you a couple of case studies of that as we go through. Yeah. So this is kind of the countermeasure we can start to come up with in the 90s. You know, how do we solve this problem? So instead of doing this process, we would say, let's do this process, where we're going to go hire the design firm and an integrator. And I will say that an integrator is different in very important ways from a CEM. CEMs manage contracts, integrators manage flow. We'll go pre-select and pre-qualify and pre-select the key participants. That's better if you can get the actual trade partners, but you'll see some examples of where we've done that without the trade partners and had that value. We'll go through this collaborative scope development as kind of an intense sprint with everyone together in this kind of big room setting. We develop the scope, and we've learned that you don't need a completed design to know what's going to cost. You need a complete scope. We can do that pretty quickly. We go through the price validation and establish target cost, and we actually still go through this cycle, but we go through it very, very rapidly, and we're updating a scope list, not an entire design. So it can be happening very, very rapidly. And the net result of that is that the target cost is identified much sooner, and is much more reliable. And you can almost always start, in fact, you can always start construction sooner. One thing, as I've asked contractors, I've been through this many, many times, and at the end of the scoping session, I'll ask, hey, are you more confident in the cost you developed here than you would have been if you'd gone and bid it off of documents? And invariably the answer is yes. We're much more confident in our scope and our cost, because we help define it, we fully understand it, we all understand each other. Yeah. So that was the process.
Yeah, like quick comment on that, John, because it's really spot on. I think you have to understand it. On the top flow, the members are always making assumptions, right? Because they don't have all the information. Contractor bidding, you know, hey, I can't consume all this information, so I'm going to make assumptions that may or may not be, or may not be right, or some could be tragically wrong. So what happens in the more efficient flow is that those assumptions are turned into real, more viable facts, and we start addressing the risks a lot much better. We start coming up with design solutions that are more worthy, right? We take those assumptions as much as we can out of the equation and turn them into something that actually gets pen to paper on that we can rely on.
Yeah. You hit a golden rule. One of our golden rules I'll share here is that the estimator never makes an assumption about the scope without clarifying it with whoever designed it. And that is kind of one of our golden rules we use during this session. So let's look a little bit, about how, Jeff, this is you went through this process, and you want to talk to us a little bit about your experience with that.
So our project was much larger than any other project that we had in the past. And so there was a lot of senior leadership concern over how this was going to go and how we ensure that not only we meet the time and the budget, but we get what we're after as well. And so when this process was introduced to us, we just jumped on it because we could see its potential. And then you can see that first picture there. We invited all the trade partners that were actually going to be doing the installation of this equipment, making the building, into the room with all of the subject matter experts from our team here. And we basically went through and we defined what the scope was going to be for this project. And it just, in that collaborative atmosphere it was quite a thing to see all those people working together. So basically by the end of that week, we had what we were looking for in terms of the scope development and a lot more confidence in what we were going to end up with.
Yeah, it was. I remember your senior plant manager who joined us, John Follett, made a comment. I think I just saw magic happen. It was because we took we did a lot of improvements in the first day. And then let's talk a little bit about how that project turned out. And if you will look at this was kind of how it was supposed to happen. We were in the CDS process about here, and we were scoping, coming up with the target cost while the pilot plant was making the last batches of the product to validate that the process would deliver the intended results. And then we were going to go on through design and construction and equipment installation and have the first product out in about April of year 3. But notice we started towards the end of year 1, so it's about a 1.5 year project. Well, what actually happened is, when we got there, and Jeff will remember this painfully well, is that the actual trial, the products that came out of the pilot process didn't meet the requirements, and it went through a complete not just a reselection of equipment, but fundamentally different technology. And by the way, the customer was still expecting that fiber that we were going to make on the same date. And so the detailed design, of course, you can't finish the design until you finish selecting the equipment. And so, Fernando, what would you guess? If I were going to show you this situation, what would you expect? How far over to the right do you think we'd be going with that first product?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. And you know that the actual detail design, being that close, it would probably double the amount of planned building, construction, and equipment installation you got there.
Yeah, well, what actually happened was, we actually did, and this is actually a thing, one of the great things that Jeff and his team did is by focusing on the right things at the right times, we actually got that first product out in the middle of April instead of the 1st of April, is my recollection. And that was a great accomplishment. And in fact, I love this. I'm showing you over here, I don't use my camera, but we got this great award from Jacobs, who had just acquired us from CHM. That was kind of a project year award for how we pulled that out. But how did it happen? Well, we did have the collaborative scoping that we talked about. So we had a team, and there was a no blame culture, and there was this tremendous focus. Everyone there was trying to help Jeff and his team get this project done, and Jeff and his team accepted the help. And I think that was really important. On the technical side, we did use a lot of pull-based thinking, and I think the startup Kanban was really helpful. But there was also a lot of pretty exceptional teamwork happening at that point. So, Jeff, if you want to call it was your project, you got any other comments about how that, well, we might not have talked about yet?
So, as John alluded to at the beginning, we had an existing plant that had equipment, but we wanted the new plant to have different equipment. So we brought it to the existing plant to try to make it work, and it didn't work the first time. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and some of it we just had to redo completely. And that's what delayed a lot of this, plan detailed design. But because we had that collaborative team on board and kept them informed, they were prepared. And we just moved to the stuff that we could do at the time and understood the basics and what was going to happen next. And so it just really helped to keep that whole team in the loop and have no blame, which can be difficult sometimes because we're used to that as a culture, you know, who you want to push the blame onto on the contract. But I think the first few times that it didn't happen, the contractors really understood that we were in this together, and that really helped draw the team together.
Yeah, the other big, this pull thing was we spent essentially zero time trying to get back to the original plan. The whole time we were just focused on how do we get here. Okay, and so it wasn't like we were trying to maximize earned value or anything else. So a lot of the traditional recovery methods you would have used on traditional project management wouldn't have gotten you here. It was that kind of agile approach that really helped us. So I'll talk just briefly here now something completely different. This was a much smaller internal project, and this was a job where I was working with the Burns McDonnell company. We actually presented this at a design forum, but they wanted to build internally a very large and sophisticated fab shop for piping and modules and things like that. And they'd gone through a traditional development with all the engineers and spent a lot of time, and came up at a cost that was not even close to what they wanted. And there was a lot of frustration. So I'd come on board about that time, so well, let's give you a shot at it. And so we actually did a mini CDS where we didn't even engage the trade contractors. You know, we were preliminary enough to go do that. Toward, you know, I was a surrogate for some of them. We had a couple of our people inside the company who were very experienced, and we went through this scope list and this thing, and we used a lot of sketches, a lot of things just to communicate the scope. And what it turned out, the owner ended up having a much clearer understanding of what the scope was and why it cost that much, because it was organized in a way that was useful to him. The cost rolled up to the functions that he would have, not to a design discipline or a CSI account. And we ended up finding out that this was not the right project, that some other approach would be good, but we found it out the second time without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on design. And I love the quote from one of our most experienced estimated and pre-construction guy. He says, I'm very confident that we were at plus or minus 15% accuracy. But of course, we're at about 2% engineering. And Fernando, do you want to comment on what the value of that little box might be?
Yeah, well, if you can be that accurate at that little bit of engineering, because everybody fully understands how it's all going to come together, you know, that's a huge win, because people are going to move forward with the idea that, you know, with design and engineering to match that scope that's been decided, and better communication. So yeah, anything at 2% and that level of accuracy is just
yeah. This is that. I just thought that was pretty telling. I'm going to real quick thing for those of you familiar with the CII approach, which is probably a lot of people on this call. You're probably used to something. This was another sketch that Burns and Mac came up when I was there, of going through FEP 1, 2, and 3, and having your PDRIs. And God bless you if you actually use those. We used the PDRI on Jeff's project, and it was very helpful, if I remember correctly. And then what we're really talking about is doing this. It compresses all this, and you bring all this much faster. And so you're actually launching the project with much better comprehension, much sooner. And to me, this is just subjective. The relative risk of missed scope and cost is proportionate to, you know, that is much greater with conventional than it is with scoping. The people on the project understand their scope a lot better, and that's very valuable. So a few key points here we'll make is, you know, if you summarize collaborative scope development, kind of the elevator speech is this concept: you can validate the cost scope without full design. And actually the scope, understanding the scope is more important and more useful than typical bid documents. And that will help you avoid a myriad of forms of risk, frustration, and delay that come from not understanding the scope. And I used to say you will usually result in a more stable scope, but I would say now it always delivers a more constructible scope, because the team that's going to construct it help define the scope. You're going to have a much higher degree of scope comprehension and a comprehension of the interfaces, and that's always going to be faster than design build. And a key point here we can talk about on some other webinar is competition and collaboration are not mutually exclusive. You can actually get a more competitive selection process than you might have been getting before. And I never said it was easy. So any other kind of wrap up comments from Jeff or Fernando as we're kind of talking about this concept of collaborative scope development?
I'd say the main takeaway for me was just embrace the process. The more you invest into really just going with it, then that's what's going to return the rewards. If you hold back, then you're not going to get the full benefit.
Yeah, that would be the times I've seen this not work out is where there was no commitment to it and teams kind of bailed on defining a scope. So, hey, it's great, get everybody in a big room together. We talked about all kinds of good stuff. And so how do we get from the people and Post-it notes on the wall and the sketches and guys doing presentations? And by the way, that is a general format, I believe, explaining how we're going to go build something to the design team. We use a work integration structure with fundamental scope blocks. And that's kind of that's a concept that's been developing now for 20 some years. But a fundamental scope block is basically a chunk of work that provides a particular function. And it's always a noun. And it kind of helps you define how the job is going to be constructed or commissioned. So if you had a fundamental scope block for a pipe rack, that pipe rack would include all of the different pipes and cable trays and things that would go on that conveyance piece, as opposed to having each person go run the pipe across a standard pipe rack. The other distinguishing thing is they're almost always a multi-discipline, a multi-contractor, and there's something that provides a function, but it won't work until all the work is completed. And so if you look here, this would be, I believe this is a giant air compressor, but you can't operate that until the controls are done, until the wiring is done, until the piping is done, and until the instrumentation is done. All this has to happen before the owner has use of this piece of equipment. Your fundamental scope block might look like a big piece of process equipment. It might look, you might start like this is like a hypothetical reactor. You might actually start with your team just by sketching up something like this. Said, hey, this is what we have. This is what we're going to have. You will have something very similar to what we're going on. And this happens very early in the process. Just after you've done your basic engineering to understand your capacities and what your requirements are. And going back to this air handler I talked about, let's suppose you had an air handler, because the key to the whole system is really something called a scope activity. And so if I'm going to have an air handler, I'm going to have a mechanical contractor set and anchor the air handler. And that's going to be designed by the mechanical engineer. It's going to have a concrete housekeeping pad that's probably designed by the structural engineer and installed by the piping by the concrete contractor. HVAC contractor's probably going to come back and install the duct, and someone's going to hook up the power that's designed by electrical engineer. Piping contractor, which might be separate from your HVAC contractor, he's going to hook up the chilled water supply and return. And someone's going to notice, hey, if you got chilled water supply and return, someone's going to have to put in a condensate drain. Someone's going to have to hook up the controls. And hey, we're going to have a smoke detector in the return air duct. And so who's going to install the smoke detector, and how are we going to connect it to the fire alarm? Those are all examples of scope activities. So these are specific actions that a specific crew is going to go do to enable that. And another key point that scope activity does is they connect the fundamental scope blocks. So this chilled water piping is only necessary if we install this air handler. We're still going to have a chilled water distribution system. So we always scope the scope activities with the downstream user, but what the very powerful thing about this does is it connects all your major scope elements together. So if you go change something, it's much easier to go track down what all else is going to be affected. So a few simple guidelines. This is more for the takeaway for people to look at this is it's a scope activity is a specific task to service by a single scope owner as continuous operation. It usually defines a handoff, and it's pretty darn close to what you'd be doing in a pole planning session down the road, or maybe an installation work package. And it has a single design discipline, a single system, a single performer, and the first word is always a verb. This little thing is really important to articulate exactly what that first word that defines the verb is. So, this is an actual application. It doesn't always have to be fancy. This is one that was actually used. And again, this was presented by Burns and Mack and Lockheed Martin at the LCI Congress a couple of years ago. This is an actual FSB with all the scope activities. They use this to scope out and price the job, and this was adequate for what they were doing. And this was very, very helpful. But look how similar the sketch they use is to that little block diagram that I had constructed. And that's how they looked at it. A little more useful for bigger projects is something, if you can distill it into real data, and I'll show you how this kind of comes together if you use a relational database. And Jeff, I'll give a second to talk about your early experience when you first saw this.
QuickBase for us, it was an excellent way to start organizing the project. So
yeah, and it was lucky for us that that some members of the owners team already were familiar with the platform. This is written in QuickBase, which is a relational database online, and there are versions of this app in place a lot of places that I've been. So on some very, very large companies, this is being used on a mega project now, a very, very similar structure that they would certainly recognize what this would look like. But let's look down to, let's start by breaking it down. We talked about the work breakdown. So we're gonna have some hypothetical project, and at a high level, we're gonna build some kind of a process building. This is not Jeff's project, this is a hypothetical project. We're gonna build some kind of a process building, and we're gonna have a warehouse. We're gonna have to do a whole bunch of work for site development. And of course, we wanted to capture also the general conditions and administrative risk reserve, because all of the costs of the job can be, including the GCs and the administration and the contingencies, can be represented by scope activities. That's one of our real insights. And so if we want to go look a little deeper in work breakdown, let's go look at the warehouse a little more closely. So if I pop down a level, I can see that I have a warehouse. We can talk about it. We can put what we originally thought we were going to spend on the warehouse. We can see what the costs are actually rolling up to be. These are the conditions of satisfaction and major options. And kind of the cool part about this is all of the participants have access to this database. They're all seeing it, including the owner. So one of the great aspects of this was we didn't have a project controls department sitting around preparing reports for the owner to read. Jeff could log in and see whatever he wanted to go see about his project, basically anytime in real time. So going forward a little bit more, if we want to dig in a little bit more to what fundamental scope blocks were, well, our hypothetical warehouse might have chunks of scope to look like this. This is like, I think that there were 28, and they look things like deep foundations, the building envelope, or here, the hypothetical air handler that I showed you before. So let's take a look at that. We're going to keep digging down. So here's what a hypothetical air handler looks like. This is pretty big for collaborative design, is what group owns this? So typically these projects are organized into groups of people who teams of teams. Well, you can assign each fundamental scope block to a team so they can pull up their list and focus on the things that they have. When they do their work, it automatically rolls all back up into the whole. Really handy. Now, one of the really useful things we have here is early in the project, when we're first saying we're going to have an air handler, we'll ask the design leads who thinks they have scope on this thing. And we go through this and just check off. This is a pull down menu, obviously. As we check off the people who have scope, light starts to fill the room. Oh, wow. I didn't realize we had all of this to go do. So you can see all the other things I haven't expanded out. We also talk about design criteria, risk, and all kinds of other things. But today we're just going to spend a little time on scope activities. So if I go on to that, they're just scope activities. So between the team, they capture this. And so, like I said, the structural engineer was going to design a housekeeping pad that would be installed by the concrete contractor, who turned out to be Desert Concrete. That's who we selected for it. We find all this. And so now we've broken the job down about as far as we need to. And everybody who is on the FSB will review this, and they'll all know who's doing what. As far as what size of rebar we're going to use in the housekeeping pad, the HVAC contractor doesn't care. So only the concrete contractor and the structural engineer will go to the level of detail of scope details where they actually get through and define exactly what that is. One more here as we go. So we said, okay, if we want to go look at let's go see what kind of scope this big air HVAC contractor has. So when we set this up, we go identify the work packages we think we're going to need. We think we're going to need a caissons contractor. We think we're going to need a rigging contractor. We think we're going to need a process piping contractor. And hey, here's our HVAC contractor. So remember, every scope activity is assigned to a work package name. So if I want to go see everything for the HVAC contractor, yeah, I can generate a list of everything he's got. And then also what it adds up to. So this ability to roll things up is really important. We can do it by systems. So remember, each scope activity unique to a system. So I can see all the scope activities assigned to a given system. And not only the central plant, but all of the other FSBs that connect to that system. So for example, you have something like this, and we can also connect it by pit teams. So again, there was a site pit team. These are all the FSBs they own. So when they go into their meetings, they can pull up their scope and work on it. And when they leave the meeting, the central database that everyone uses is updated in real time. Pretty slick. And so this gets back into what I call a scope flower. And if you have each scope activity that's unique to a performer, design, discipline, system, area, well then, of course, you can use it for the basis of estimate and the basis of design. That's what this was originally intended to be. It didn't take us very long to figure out, hey, this is also, it enables our scope control process. This also helps us, we can roll these up into construction and area packages, and we can even make the BIM attributes limits correspond to the scope activity. Just think how powerful that is when you're visualizing your job. If the BIM model matches your basic scope definition, and of course, I was a scheduler hard by early. These should actually roll up into your schedule activities, and it makes progress reporting and earned value very, very easy. You will have no need to go out for rules of credit, which sounds heretical to some people in the project controls world, but this is so much easier to go do it. So this is what we call the scope flower and the whole concept of intrinsically integrated information. So when you look at this for AWP, you start breaking it down from the program elements, bundle scope blocks, and scope activities. But then on the integration side, you roll these back. And so that's been a long stretch of me talking. Fernando, you want to share your thoughts about this whole concept of rolling back up into other elements?
Yeah. So that's one thing. Being largely in the advanced work packaging arena right now, more industrial projects. And yes, this background of lean, it really comes in handy. But the fact that we can understand this very early on, how all these fundamental scope blocks can be looked at prior to even coming out with major plot plans. What are the equipment? What are the tag items we have to think about? And we start learning. From my opinion, we start learning about the relationships between the different trades and the importance and the priorities of the things that we do install. And that will help inform us into developing better work package boundaries. I need to get this done because the electrical needs to happen here, or a structural thing is going to happen, and they know when the boundary is going to end. I can set something just because we can look at the trade-offs of relationships. And it might be so, hey, I'm going to set something really heavy on that steel, and can you design the deflection the right way, because I have certain tolerances I have to live with. And it's going to be important because I know when this happens, the rest of everything else is going to shift on us. And if we have to fight the steel all the way up, whatever, that's a problem. So can we address it now, because this is a reality? So it's going to help inform us how to make better decisions on how we think of our work package definitions and boundaries, and the integration, the integration potential, the increased integration potential.
Oh, yeah.
That we bring in. All right.
I know this looks like when I also had a project controls background early in my career, and if we would have had this kind of source information to start, your project controls function is so much easier. And so this opens up all kinds of possibilities. So we talked about a work breakdown structure and the corresponding work integration structure. So we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of a work breakdown structure. And so typically, like my friend Glenn said, butchering a cow is one thing, putting it back together is a whole different thing. So typically we reduce the project into successfully smaller parts, typically by design discipline or specs, and then each design discipline basically develops their scope and their design and their definition in relative isolation. That's our typical way of working. And each contractor has to deduce their scope in near total isolation. So they've got to dig through all these documents and try and figure out what it is that they're supposed to be bidding on. And it's communicated in all kinds of ways. It might be on the model, it might be on a spreadsheet, there might be text narratives, there might be emails, there might be drawings. And my favorite one is the classic, you should have known. I didn't write it down any place, but you should have known this. And of course, scope changes originate from myriad sources, and periodically we have reviews, we have design reviews, we have constructability reviews to try and fix it. But in a lean world, doing a bunch of work and then coming back to fix it is viewed as waste. And so fundamentally, we're trying to do something different. So we're going to try and group FSBs that intrinsically align the scope to cost and value. Because remember, if we price it by the scope activities, those all roll up to FSBs. So Jeff could see what each FSB was really going to cost him, which is like brand new information. And I'll make that a little more detailed. If you went and bought a car, the last time you bought a car, you probably cared what kind of engine it had. You probably cared what kind of stereo it had. You probably cared what kind of interior, what the features and functions that car had. You probably didn't care at all for how many inches of wire were in a car or how many pounds of steel. So if you'd have gotten a typical construction estimate for your car and you saw it cost too much, you would really have no idea of what you really wanted to go change. This helps solve that problem. The other problem it helps solve is the natural interface between construction and startup, because you already have your activities defined. So the transition from construction by area to startup by system, you've already got the scope breakdown to enable that. These create a natural forum for design and construction, and of course the startup I just talked about, and they also underlie the production strategy. So we go from work breakdown structure to work integration to intrinsically integrated data. And so another big waste thing is when every different group on the project goes off and develops the scope in their own understanding in their own way, they're all writing it down redundantly. And so this is a way for everybody to use the same data that has to be developed once, and then quite likely referenced for future projects, and then the coordination is built in. We don't have constructability reviews on the projects that go this way. We have previews, and we have drastically fewer RFIs because thousands of RFIs get answered that never need to be written down because they were asked before the design was done. So those are some of the big edges of this and the fundamental scope blocks. And as we start wrapping this up, Fernando, you want to kind of see how this all fits together?
Yeah, and you know, one comment I do want to make is the fact that we look at our conventional approaches, and we put a lot of burden on project controls for sure by saying this is how we break down a project, right? We deconstruct it, and then we have to reconstruct it based on conversations around these scope, these different elements. And I think one thing I really want to emphasize is that if you have this, you may deconstruct that project differently, right, to make it more efficiently, and then reconstruct it differently than you would differently from what you would put in a typical project schedule. So I think getting some of that fundamental understanding is really critical here. And this listing here are the tools that all go to help make those kind of decisions, right? So the front end, and you look at this preparation for target value design and integrated teams, starting with the business case, NextGen approach, you know, look at program elements, conditions of satisfaction, which, you know, those conditions of satisfaction extend not just beyond the owner, but what are the conditions of satisfaction with all the other stakeholders that might be important. And a fundamental scope block conversation really promotes this better understanding of what makes things work better, right? So, and as we move into collaborative scope development and validation, right, we can explore things, we can challenge things, we can look at options more readily and make early decisions before we start locking things into detailed engineering, right, when it becomes too late and we're kind of stuck with those decisions. So, you know, and I understand cost and risk are big parts of it, but our path of construction from the AWP side will be a much richer experience because we'll know what the associations are between different packages, from what engineering needs to do to support something, construction, procurement, all the way down to installing and finally to systems and completion packages. And then that, of course, drives something downstream, much more robust. We're designing and developing things that are based on agreements in place and a deeper understanding of the entirety of the scope. So one thing I do want to emphasize, and we talk about collaboration, but it's the teams that come together, and everybody talks about we want to create high performance teams. Well, what does that mean, right? And where does fundamental scope blocks all the way throughout the whole life cycle start being able to the common denominator that gets people back, aligned to what the integration points are. So production control systems, all these things, and sequencing of construction for flow and turnover completion, of course, are critical. But it allows us to do things that we already do in theory and in business, but we have to do it better, more conscientiously focused on some of this. So we get away from the transactional type of environments that we typically fall into, because it's easier to do that, right? Even though we might adopt AWP, we might adopt lean, we might adopt project production management, but if we keep treating these things as a check the box, right, and not form teams that actually dive into things, I think we miss a big point. So this is kind of the layout of all the opportunities that we have in the NextGen environment.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And for people, if you, I presume most folks tuning in here probably a little more closely aligned with the CII methods and the AWP. The big things you're going to see the difference is this whole scope validation that goes here to launch all this, and then this concept of distributed planning and control versus with integrated teams. This is the way this is different than a very hierarchical situation. So this is what I would call network project management, which is fundamentally different than hierarchical project management. That's one thing to get your kind of head around. So if we were kind of saying, how does this thing start? This slide here is to kind of say this is something that at least I've been working on for a long time. Is when I was studying for my PMP exam in 1993, I believe, I recognized that all the project management theories said you'd have this great list of all the scope and who was going to go do what. And I got thinking, I don't think I've ever seen that. I need to go create that. So I started working on that concept. Not long after that, we came into this concept of collaborative design and scoping. And we were starting to use this scope list. We had a project for an owner who did not have time to design and build it. So I said, hey, let's develop a scope list and price that. That was going well. Meantime, one of our teams was working with the Neenah company in Fort Collins, and they were doing this, programming in a day or collaborative design sessions. And so we got together and combined those things for something we call collaborative design and scoping. So that's been going on for some times, and it was right at that point we started actually using the scope list was the basis of the contract. So the design documents helped define the scope list, but the scope list was the contract. Where I met Fernando was on a project in the early 2000s, and he was with a firm called Strategic Project Solutions, and they came up and helped us with a very, very complex industrial project. And we started using all of that. Then one of the big changes is when I'll give a little credits here is Pat Wenger, part of Mechanical. We were starting another very critical project for a large microelectronics firm that has big operations in Hillsboro, Oregon. And he said, I love your scope list, John, but if the spreadsheets are awkward, let me show you how you do this in QuickBase. And so that really enabled a lot of things, including mega project application. So you can use fundamentals, you can keep rolling these things up, and there really isn't a list. That app I showed you is being used now on at least one multi-billion-dollar microelectronics factory, and probably more. And then as we go a little further on, now we're going into NextGen. We've reached back out to the project production management folks and AWP and lean, and we're trying to take all this stuff going forward. So that's kind of how this has been going forward. It's not something we dreamed up for this webinar. It's something we've been trying to share. And these concepts, when I met Fernando at a trade show a number of years ago, and we had talked about lean and AWP, it was these concepts I had in mind. Says, I think we could use these to link lean and AWP. And that was really kind of, in my mind, how we started to the concept. So wrapping things, Fernando, I'm getting worn out. You want to help close this thing down and tell us what key points were?
Yeah, for sure. So yes, from an advanced work packaging, and whether you're into ADP or not, there is still these takeaways, and I think some enhanced value that you should be able to easily understand that this early cost validation is important everywhere, and it really helps drive the decisions. So getting that at a lower design percentage complete is valuable, so we can keep tracking. that's the target value, right? So hey, we're always constantly rethinking: are we hitting our target value? Are we beating it? And that's highly valuable. Integrated trades and discipline. Hey, the more we bring in people early, the more we have these conversations, the more we learn from each other and what's important from each other, and how we should proceed forward. At least keeps everybody somewhat satisfied. And we believe in this heavily in AWP, thinking with the end in mind, and understanding what those commissioning packages are and aligning people to those. And equipment availability and supply chain can be much, much more important. And that's aligning to that. Supports commissioning program is going to be key. And of course, effective change control. Change is big. And this helps bring people together to make better decisions and not panic or fall into some kind of chaos.
Yeah, so and by the way, if you have questions or comments, be curious both about your takeaways and your questions that we'll be looking at here for a few minutes as we wrap up. And these are just some of the key wrap-up points. Hey, frustrations can be, one of the big problems we have with projects is we don't understand the scope. And scope complexity and content is routinely and seriously underestimated. Almost all project teams underestimate their scope complexity, even if they understand that all project teams underestimate the scope complexity. And so this is a way to get this up on the table. You need scope definition, but not detailed design to establish the cost. This is a team sport. It's a team sport. So you have to embrace this whole management of teams approach to make this really work. You can distill the scope and risk and uncertainties. The app I showed you helps. If you have a work breakdown structure is great, but you need a corresponding work integration structure. And then that's formed on the backbone of scope activities, the fundamental scope blocks, and our basic premise that lean, advanced work packaging, and also collaborative contracting and project production management can be built upon each other to make this stronger. So there's a lot of folks. Let's put this here because I can't acknowledge everyone, but a few folks in particular have really done quite a lot, including Bob Kirkendall and Bob Miles, who I believe are both retired. But those are the guys that came back from Neiman Company and said, "Hey, we got something to show you," and I said, "Hey, I got something to show you." And that's what really kind of started out with the whole concept of collaborative scope development. And Harder Mechanical has also been on this job, many of these projects with us, and they've been a real edge, in addition to help showing us how to use QuickBase. So, Fernando, do we have any questions or complaints from the audience?
Yeah, so just a reminder, we have a question panel that you can enter questions into, but we do have a few. So I'll start out here. So first question is, how about a build to budget type of project? Based on what's the available project, how would this approach support that?
Well, I think it's exactly that. Is that we know what the target is. This actually comes from product design. When you're going to go, GM knows that they want to sell a four-wheel drive pickup with certain features for $53,000. Can we come up with a way to go build that? And this is the same process. This is exactly build to budget, but you're getting the pricing information from the people who are actually doing the work, not someone who's going to go out and get bids for someone to do the work. There's a very big difference there. I don't know if that would answer the question or not. And,
well, also I'll add to that. And when you look at target value delivery, I mean that it's really one of the purposes is say what is the budget, what is the target, and can we validate it as we start thinking about the project and start putting it together. So absolutely, this is designed for that. Another question that came up is what qualified as a mega project, total installed cost. I mean that varies, but typically, people look at 1 billion as that boundary. Others look at 500 million for a project. Total installed cost is that boundary. But with price of everything going up, 1 billion seems to be a starter.
But that's not the down limit. You use this on $10 million projects, and you can. But there's no upper limit or really even lower limit on the scale of project.
Yeah. It really is an approach, right? And even if you have a small turnaround, this kind of thinking helps support that process. All right, another question. Any consideration regarding construction at risk approach?
Is this like contract format? I can't quite read them here. My screen is a little slow refreshing. What was the question again, Fernando?
Regarding really construction at risk. So if you're a CM at risk or you're a contractor at risk, you know, how does this work there?
Well, that will vary. In general, I'll give the answer from an IPD or collaborative contracting approach. I think there's other folks on board who could comment on this also. But basically, the whole concept of IPD is that the owner holds the risk anyway, and so that this is about making all the risk and all the scope very visible and engaging the whole team to help resolve it. I listened in to Dick Bayer's comment webinar earlier this morning on Link Construction blog about progressive design build and IPD, and he said something very interesting, that of all the now hundreds of IPD projects and IFOA type projects that have been executed, less than 1% have resulted in the owner going over the risk pool. In other words, the owner paying more than the upside limit. So I think the other thing is that Michael DeBrule, I think I saw him early on, and his research team, the big thing they said is this approach reduces risk. And I couldn't agree more. That's almost the biggest benefit, is that it reduces frustration and risk. That was a long answer to a short question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, it goes into the next question. How is risk assessment done with 2% engineering? So yeah, I think pointing out that risk, yeah, go ahead.
I wish I could show you, but you can actually identify. You know, I think the 2% of engineering may have been a little metaphor. I think it's quite close to 20%. But anyways, it was very small amount. But you can identify the major project risk, particularly in your pit teams, very early. It's the risk of your project is not going to be, what do I need, a 4-inch pipe or a 6-inch pipe? You know, it's going to be, did I forget the pipe? And also getting the risk out there where everyone can talk about them and know what the mitigation plan and who's covering it. And another huge advantage of the IPD world is that the owner is not trying to turn the contractors into insurance companies. And so that the overall, the total amount of risk reserve and contingency can be less. You need less contingency to protect the system than you would need to protect each individual part. So I kind of wandered off the normal topic there, but it's a really important concept. And Fernando, is that kind of how you understand it?
Yeah, and I think when we start identifying risk, we can start addressing it as early as possible, and we get more perspective early. So to look at that, whatever that risk pool is, and then we can monitor it, because we're looking at future potential events that we're trying to avoid. And the earlier we can identify it and respond to any engineering or procurement issues or risks or construction risks, site risks, access risks, regulatory risk, now's the time to start looking at it. So absolutely, early on is great.
And everyone pays attention, because if you have an IPD contract where your profit is pooled together, you no longer say that's somebody else's problem. I'm not worried about that risk. That's somebody else's problem. I can duck it. No, you can't. It's how you're like mountain climbers roped together. You don't want the other guy to slip. So
just to add kind of an example to that, we in our project we had a major piece of equipment that we completely changed, right? But that equipment still had a foundation, it still had ducting, it still had electrical and controls and all the other things that go into that piece of equipment. So even though the equipment itself changed completely, most of the scope elements were the same, and so the risk was reduced, right?
Yeah, and just imagine the claims that would have gone into that. You know, that's been my experience several times with folks saying, "My gosh, how much time did we just avoid in claims and change orders?"
Yeah. So great. So here's another question. This one's easy about, these slides can be available, yes, after this, yes, and I think you'll also get a link to the video as well. So question, have you seen any friction points when integrating FEL process with AWP lean?
The biggest friction point is the folks who follow the FEL process aren't usually very familiar with lean. So it's like you're challenging their religion. But once you can, with a certain amount of time, like I showed on that slide we developed at Burns and Mac, it starts to come together. Yes, it's just a different way of thinking about the project, and it takes a while to get used to that.
Yeah, it's getting it involved early and having this pressure to push pump out design, but also to do it more efficiently by hearing what other stakeholders might have to say about it, right? So the fact is, yes, there's a lot of pushback in engineering procurements. They stay out of my mess kit, even if we're building packages, it's our packages. And so yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there, and we need to be better at I guess more inclusive and bringing people into this program, right? There's an onboarding process here that has to be respected for sure.
And there's a mindset too. There are some delivery methods where are primarily based on being a broker, and someone's taking packages out and using bidding processes to try and broker down the price. The people who see this as very the people who think the construction has to be a very transactional business are not attracted to this. And when I've been hanging around the Lean Construction Institute since it was formed, and what I've noticed a number of years ago is that the people who keep showing up are the people who want to work together collaboratively to get a great result. The people who see construction as a poker game, where you're trying to outfox and outmaneuver the other people, they don't hang around very long.
Okay, so another question here is, how do you ensure when involving partners in mega complex projects that they work in the same direction as yourself, especially when it comes to aligning interfaces to work packages, right? Any tools that can support that?
Well, there's all kinds of tools to support that, but fundamentally, that those people are all involved together to define that fundamental scope block. And I didn't mention this, but the most important part of that developing the fundamental scope block is the team review. When the team, all the people who have scope on that scope talk about it and discuss their scope and how it fits with everybody else. So you're building that comprehension in before it ever goes to detailed design. And then of course, there's all kinds of team-based strategies that we use on lean style projects and teams of teams projects to go develop that. And I think even Fernando, I think the AWP process has quite a few tools to help that alignment. Yeah,
and the idea here is it goes into this collaborative perspective of how do we bring people together, and key to that in a fundamental lean tenet is, hey, if we can get everybody in the same room and start planning collaboratively, whether it's through a path of construction process and then we dig deeper into, well, these are the engineering deliverables, how do we work together to actually come up with those tasks that meet those deliverables? How am I impacted by procurement? Right? If we start driving those conversations in these interactive planning processes that are held, hey, frequently, monthly, weekly, daily, right? We're going to get some great results, and that's how we drive alignment, because all of a sudden you start understanding what your downstream customers really need, or what the upstream customer from you really understands about your need to get your work done. So it's putting that process in place and putting these tools, because we're going to start getting a lot of data. And as John said, there's lots of tools out there, and we could, that's a pretty deep conversation about what works and what works well. What even some of the most basic, hey, organizing it. What Jeff said about, we've got QuickBase that he used to look at the fundamental scope blocks. And in other ways, we have work packaging tools, we have design tools, we have all these things that have to integrate together and allow us to do planning processes and work execution and planning, work execution and production control kind of things that are really important in driving this forward. So it's a really great question. It deserves a lot more than 1 minute of answering, but for sure, that's the key to this whole thing, right?
But just imagine if all those systems were talking about the same scope.
Yeah.
Okay, that's like the golden nugget there.
Yeah, and in fact, here's the next question. I love this one. With collaborative scope development, how do you get competitive bids, or is this more of a sole source approach?
Well, you get your competitive bids before that. So this could be a whole separate webinar, but basically, you go out, interview the contractors on the basis of their capabilities and their pricing factors. And so the short way I explain this is, if you're a contractor bidding a job, you're going through that final review, what you're talking about are your markups, your general conditions. You're probably not talking about whether there's 100 feet of pipe or 120 feet of pipe. And the market pressure works great over the things that the bidders have discretion to change. So the bidders don't really have discretion to change the scope. There's some variation in how they understand it, but they don't have the discretion over what the scope is. What they have discretion over is their pricing factors. And if you have a rough cost model of the job, you can just ask the contractors what their pricing factors are going to be. So basically, it's a very, Jeff, we used like a 2-page RFP. Basically, tell us how you're going to help us, and 2, tell us what markup you want, what overhead and profit you need, what other pricing factors you have, and they were able to answer this very quickly. So you remember, Jeff, that from the time you said we'd like to go this approach until we had the contractors competitively selected and in a CDS was like 6 or 7 weeks. Is that how you remember it?
That's about right. And it just requires a level of transparency from the contractor that they may not be used to giving, but they're there to make money, right? So if they just tell you this is how I want to make money and that's how they compete, that's it. You just agree to it, right? So
yeah, because if you don't do something like this, right? Hey, defining the scope, because when you prepare a bid and you want that to be as complete and address as much as you can, so getting early involvement by people to describe and define that scope for bidding, right? You're in a much better position, because as soon as you release that bid out to everybody else, guess what? Everything else is a change order, right?
Yeah.
Or you're responding and you're making decisions in a very, very short bidding period that may be the wrong decisions, right?
One of the things I figured out early in my career as I was administering and managing, subcontracts of that nature is I needed my team of contractors motivated to help me mitigate my problems, not exploit them. And so if you use the full market leverage to drive someone's price down, hey, they're going to use the full market leverage when something changes. And that's just kind of the game. That's the tune you called and the tune they're dancing to.
Yeah. So got one more question here, and it's an important one. How does a company get started, right, if we're going to do this?
Yeah, do some research and then get a hold of some people who have been there before. This is not a do-it-yourself kit. Even though some of us originally figured this out, but find some people who have been through this. I was going to say it really helps when you have at least one of the trade partners on the team that's been through it with you before. That really makes things a lot simpler. I think in Jeff's case, every contractor was brand new because we were in a part of the country in the Southeast US where collaborative contracting just wasn't common yet. So don't start from scratch if you don't need to. Take advantage of what other people have figured out.
Yeah. And as Jeff said, if you embrace this going forward, because probably inherently, these are real problems in the industry, and we have countless stories that say that it is that, hey, it's better to start understanding it, looking at how your organization can apply it, figure out how what coalition you need to build within your organization to get some acceptance, because it's change is difficult, and some organizations are much more open and embrace it. Absolutely. Others are going to resist it, and that's going to be the discouraging part, right? Hey, we have a great idea. It's like, hey, here's a round wheel instead of a square one, but it gets rejected. We're not changing, So
hey, we've been using square wheels for a long time, buddy.
Yeah.
You don't need to tell us about wheels.
Yeah. Just get another person to push from the back, and you'll move. So yes, it depends on the organization, but build that coalition, get the facts right. Get some win case studies that you can share, and start small. You don't have to knock this out of the ballpark, but hey, one step forward and getting some benefit is better than living in a frustrating world.
People usually come out of this asking, why don't you do all projects this way? This was so much easier. And so that's kind of a closing note. Maybe I really appreciate the folks who have hung in here with us for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Hope you got something out of it. And we'll have, Fernando, I think we have some more webinars on the docket.